Hello, and welcome to Capturing Conflict, the History of War Photography, a webinar and course taster for a lifelong learning course I will be teaching on the subject. My name is Hira Azhar, and I'm a final year doctoral researcher in history at the University of Southampton and the Imperial War Museum. My collaborative doctoral project explores the history of visual influence in war, examining a collection of over 17,000 born digital Islamic State, the terrorist group Islamic State propaganda photographs from between 2014 and 2019, alongside the IWM's considerable Ministry of Defense photo collections. I'm a historian. I did my undergraduate and master's degrees at the University of York and the London School of Economics, respectively, and I've previously worked as a newspaper editor, academic researcher, and prior to starting this doctorate in counter-extremism policy. I've been teaching core and elective history modules to students here at Southampton for the past 2 years, focusing on source analysis, especially for visual sources, modern political and social history with a special focus on political movements, conflict, and image analysis. In terms of non-teaching activities I've been involved in at the IWM, I was one of the contributors to their ongoing exhibition on sexual violence and conflict, which I would highly encourage you to check out if you can, on the section on ISIS's crimes against Yazidi women. And last year I held an exhibition on war photography for the Arts and Humanities Festival here at Southampton. I've also worked with the research software group here at Southampton using their high-performance computing facilities, basically their supercomputer, to help with the cataloging of the ISIS photo collection at the IWM. I'm also just generally very interested in public history because I think it is more imperative than ever that historians and other scholars are able to better communicate the research to non-specialists with accuracy. In that respect, I'm currently developing a podcast on war imagery where I speak to various people within the field, including photographers, documentary filmmakers, journalists, academics, and curators. So that's just a little bit about me. In terms of my research interests, so they're largely focused within contemporary conflicts and modern political and social history with a relatively recent leaning towards visual history due to my doctoral research. 20th and 21st century conflicts are an area of historical study I've always had a keen interest in, but understanding how influence, and particularly visual influence, operates within the context of war has been my main focus and interest for the past few years, and for good reasons. The rapid digitization of our lives has meant that we are exposed to war imagery at all times, for good or for bad. And on a personal level, I was drawn to the untold, unexplored aspects of modern warfare, the untold stories, so to speak, and exploring how it connects to the rest of the world. In my current research, for example, my focus is on the capturing of non-combat scenes. So this often includes combatants at rest. So what combatants, and that includes soldiers, professional soldiers, as well as insurgents, as well as terrorist fighters, what they do when they're not engaged in combat. So to start with, what makes the history of war imagery such a fascinating subject? We can start with how highly romanticized it is, right? Be it in fiction, such as the recent film on the photographer Lee Miller, featuring Kate Winslet, or the excellent 2018 film on Marie Colvin, featuring Rosamund Pike, or the large number of often award-winning documentaries and public programming on the war photographer and their work, such as the 2017 documentary on Chris Hondros, or the 2012 film on the acclaimed photographer Don McCullin, or even the space and imagination we regularly afford to war imagery in places like the Blavatnik Art, Film and Photography Galleries at the Imperial War Museum, but certainly also other dedicated spaces for public viewing around the world. The truth is, we are inclined to witness and memorialize war in fiction as well as public history and commentary, and we're especially drawn to visual evidence of this most violent of political events. Second, war imagery enjoys a level of ubiquity now thanks to increasing digitization. It's everywhere. The story of war imagery is as much about technological innovation and an evolving media ecosystem as it is about its use by various conflict actors. So advancements in camera technology have meant that while the photographer Roger Fenton's photographic equipment had to be driven around in a horse-drawn cart during the Crimean War in 1855, modern-day photographers can capture and share photographs with the rest of the world in under a minute. through a device that they can keep in their pockets. So driven by the two crucial factors of A, affordability, and B, portability, this has continued from black and white photographs to color photographs to digital cameras, smartphone, and drone cameras. And this has facilitated the democratization of photography itself, the ability for anyone, combatant, civilian, aid worker, to capture and share images of war. But this increased accessibility to photo taking, photo sharing, and photo viewing has meant that it has become harder to read images and, more importantly, to trust them. These days, this includes AI generated images, of course, but there's a long history of visual disinformation in this space, going right back to the start of conflict photography itself, in fact, including the repurposing of images, doctored imagery, deepfakes, and even the passing off of video game and film footage as real. But let's take AI generated images as an example, as this screenshot shows. It's become increasingly easy to manufacture war images. And as this technology improves over time, it's become more important than ever that we learn to keep up not just with how we can read images, but also how they can be manipulated and how they are manipulated. And this evolution includes an expansion of the genre of war photography itself, from documentation to a much broader understanding of what constitutes a war image. So take these two examples. On the left is an image of two Ukrainian soldiers, drone operators, ostensibly involved in real-time combat. And on the left, the artist David Birkin's 2014 installation, the photograph of an aircraft banner spelling out the shadow of a doubt, circling the Statue of Liberty's torch on Veterans Day. This is one half of a pair of public performances relating to the US government's use of drones for the purposes of targeted assassinations. And these interventions were prompted by a letter that the CIA sent to the American Civil Liberties Union, rejecting their Freedom of Information Act request for documents pertaining to a classified but widely reported program. So I would argue that both of these images are part of the genre of war photography, but this is a highly contested debate, one that has always existed, and it's important to see how the debate itself has evolved since the 1850s. And lastly, so much of our understanding of the visuals of war have been shaped by its presence outside of the combat zone in films, television, video games, even everyday fashion. Think only of camouflage clothing, combat boots, even subversive elements like the balaclava. It is important to evaluate the interconnectedness of war imagery and how that has shaped our understanding of all war-related visuals, and perhaps most crucially, of the processes and delivery mechanisms that bring them to our sight. So I've got two case studies that I can that I'll be presenting, and I think they provide a sort of well-rounded, good sort of sample of what the course will be about. The first is I'd like to examine one of the most powerful photographic records of 20th century warfare, one that possibly many of you will recognize, and arguably the most well-known photograph from the photographer Robert Capa's magnificent 11 series of images, the only surviving images from the photographs Capa took on the morning of June 6, 1944, on D-Day, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. So Robert Capa, if you don't know of him, was a renowned Hungarian-American war photographer and photojournalist, celebrated for his powerful and intimate depictions of conflict, particularly during the Spanish Civil War and World War II. He co-founded the Magnum Photos Agency and is remembered for his very courageous close quarters style of photography, and died tragically in 1954 when he stepped on a landmine in what was then known as Indochina. This image, called The Face in the Surf, shows a lone American soldier, partially submerged, gripping his helmet with both hands, his face tense, eyes wide, frozen in a moment between survival and death. Bullets are likely slicing through the water around him. In a sense, this image, shaky, blurry, grainy, does not offer too many details, perhaps to the modern eye, but it captures the emotion, or more specifically, the fear of that moment precisely. It's because of its imperfection that it's become such an unforgettable image. That blurriness is fear, it is movement, and I would argue it is war. Now, why does this photo resonate more than others? Because it doesn't glorify war, right? It humanizes it. That soldier is not a nameless prop. He is us. He could be our brother, our son, our friend. He could be someone we know, we've met. Kappa was embedded with the first wave of troops landing on Omaha Beach. He was carrying multiple cameras, shooting both 35mm and medium format film. Under intense machine gun fire and chaos, death, and rising turf, he captured what few others did: the raw terror and courage of men at war. Now, taking cover behind beach obstacles and a disabled tank, Kappa began snapping photographs with one of several Contax cameras he carried with him. After the war, Kappa remembered that as he tried to replace a spent roll of film, his hands shook uncontrollably, and he ruined a new roll before he could load it to take more pictures. In that moment, he felt, and I quote, "a new kind of fear shaking my body from toe to hair and twisting my face," end quote. And Kappa once famously also said, I quote, "if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough," end quote. He lived and nearly died by that mantra. On D-Day, he was as close as a photographer could get without being killed himself. Now, Kappa says he took 106 pictures in the first 2 hours of the invasion. He returned with the unprocessed films to London within hours in order to meet a publication deadline for Life magazine's next issue. Where a staff member made a mistake in the darkroom, he set the dryer too high and melted the emulsion in the negatives in 3 complete rolls and over half of a 4th roll. Only 11 frames in total were recovered. Those 11, now legendary, are haunting. They're not action-packed in the Hollywood sense, but they're real. Faces ducking underwater, bodies crouched behind obstacles, soldiers running, half lost in spray and smoke. But this story, powerful as it is, gets much more interesting. The historian and critic A.D. Coleman has suggested that this famous and widely disseminated story is implausible because, among other things, the temperatures used by such dryers would not have been hot enough to melt or set fire to film. He claims instead that Kappa might have only stayed on the beach long enough to make the 11 surviving exposures that we see now and then left. This controversy only reinforces something we see time and time again: the mythologizing of war stories, even from the perspective of war photographers. And it's important to ask why this undeniably extraordinary subject attracts even more embellishment and drama. Now, nevertheless, Kappa's 11 images were published in Life magazine just days after D-Day, and despite the loss of the other photographs, if they existed, Kappa's photographs have shaped how we visualize the landings in Normandy on D-Day in 1944. And part of that has been how Kappa's visuals have been reinforced via other visual means. So in 1998, Steven Spielberg released his film Saving Private Ryan, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And the very memorable opening sequence of Tom Hanks and his battalion arriving at Omaha Beach was heavily inspired by Kappa's 11 photographs. In fact, while touring the National Second World War Museum's original D-Day exhibit in 2000 in New Orleans, Spielberg told the museum's founder that Kappa's photos, and I quote, "with all the vibration, the unsteadiness that informed every single inch of the photographic approach to Private Ryan, every single frame of that movie was inspired by those shots," end quote. As this course will explore, this is a very common occurrence, and with time we see reciprocity in these influences with combatants, be they professional soldiers or terrorist fighters, drawing inspiration from films and other visual media. Now, that is a sort of a selection of very memorable images that we've probably come across and seen in our in all, in school or in university or just generally. But I would argue that part of the discussion also involves looking at images that we may not have been exposed to, or images that are more recent that expand the genre more broadly. So while this course explores the history of war photography, it is also focused on how war imagery itself has evolved and continues to change, so that we see new types of images and can explore questions around what we consider to be a war photograph, how that perception varies amongst us as the viewer, but also those taking, curating, publishing, and exhibiting these images. One example is this image from 2014 that challenges the way we think about modern warfare, surveillance, and human life, called #NotABugSplat. That's a mouthful. Seeing war from the sky. It's a haunting image that blends activism, art, and protest in one of the most drone-surveilled places on Earth, northwestern Pakistan. At first glance, it's a photograph of a little girl, laid flat so that she can be seen staring upward, solemnly, almost peacefully. But this isn't just a portrait, it's a massive poster laid flat on the ground in a field near a village in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan. Her image is so large that it's visible from the sky, especially to drones. And this project was born out of a protest. Between 2004 and 2014, the US conducted hundreds of drone strikes in Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas, especially in North Waziristan. Now, these strikes were aimed at suspected militants, but many civilians, including children, were killed. And drone operators sitting in rooms halfway around the world often saw their targets through black and white infrared screens. People, especially smaller figures like children, were reduced to blips. If a human being appeared as a tiny shape on a monitor, indistinguishable from other targets, the term some operators used was, unofficially but chillingly, a bug splat, like an insect crushed on a windshield. So in 2014, an anonymous group of artists supported by the Foundation for Art and Creative Technology, Reprieve, and Pakistan's Foundation for Fundamental Rights created this project inspired by the French photographer JR, who installs hugely magnified portraits of local people in the landscape. They traveled to Pakistan, bringing with them a giant poster of this unnamed child who is said to have lost both her parents and two younger siblings in one of the attacks. Having secured the agreement of local people, which was very important to them, they unrolled the picture and fixed it flat on the ground in a field beside a group of houses. And you can see that these are very traditional, rustic-looking village houses where drones could see her. It was both a message and a question. Can you still pull the trigger when you're staring into a human face, particularly that of a child? The campaign's name, hashtag not a bug splat, is deliberately jarring. It confronts the dehumanizing language of remote warfare. The hashtag was designed to spread the image on social media, which again is part of the discourse on war imagery now, which is that the easy access to these images, sparking conversation beyond traditional media, especially among younger, digitally literate audiences. But what makes this image interesting to me is that it's more than a photograph. It's a form of resistance. It forces us to confront the moral cost of distance. The idea that if we don't have to see the consequences of violence, we might become numb to them. Juxtaposition of the ground and the sky, the physical distance is also emphasized in this image. But there's also the juxtaposition of technology, the high quality printing of this massive poster and the very rural settings it's placed in. And above all, what's important, what comes across in this image to me is the perspective compared to drone footage that we often see, blurry, sometimes grayscale. This is high definition. And while the black and white poster reinforces how this child might appear to drone operators, it's certainly interesting to see how the use of the green within this picture, what that signifies and what that means, or the sand-colored hue of these houses. So unlike classic war photography that often captures destruction or military prowess, this image uses stillness to provoke action. It speaks to a new era of warfare, remote, invisible, and often unaccountable. What does it mean to fight wars where the enemy is unseen and the victims are nameless? What kind of ethics can exist in a system where decisions to kill are made by watching screens? So these are all questions that we will consider in the course, and that are of great interest and the source of great debate within the field as well. So this is just a brief outline of the 6-week course, which will consist of plenty of opportunities to sit together and, using a broad selection of reading and photographs, discuss the various perspectives that have historically determined what we see of war via editorial, curatorial selection. So the course is as much about the war imagery as it is about the processes behind it, the framing of these images and the selection of them. So we'll start with the early days of photography, pre-photography, war imagery, the kind of images taken in the Crimean War and the American Civil War, and the accelerated development of camera and film technology, before moving on in the second week to propaganda and censorship, so photographs that were used as a propaganda tool in both world wars, and the subject of censorship versus growing public demand for conflict photographs and growing public appetite for seeing documentation of war, for witnessing war, so to speak, and the rise of these iconic wartime photographers that we see that we'll be looking at as well, including Don McCullin. Before moving on to television and the photographing of protest movements, which we see with the Vietnam War, and how those photographs shape and impact public opinion. So that includes visual propaganda from the Cold War. It includes anti-war movements in photographs and also film. And then we move on to small wars, to humanitarian photography, to the 24-hour news cycle that includes the Gulf War, cable television, embedded photographers, again, small wars and the rise in the journalism of attachment, and a new generation of photographers. And we'll end in the last 2 weeks with photography in the digital age, which is of particular interest to me. So digital cameras, Photoshop, the growing digital manipulation of conflict imagery, soldiers' own photographs. So what happens when soldiers or combatants more broadly have access to cameras in their pockets? Have access to mechanisms for sharing those photographs, which the social media and the internet afford to them. So this includes inside views of the war on terror, drone shots, and video footage. And we'll end with, terrorist photo propaganda on social media, which we start seeing in 2014 with the Islamic State's brutal, horrific imagery that they share on Twitter and elsewhere. But also TikTok and the war in Ukraine and how soldiers have presented themselves via the medium of TikTok and the future of war photographs. So what happens when these AI generated images that we've spoken about, what happens when they proliferate and when we see more of them? So I'll end with this. War photographs have always been perceived differently at different times and by different audiences. Photographs published during ongoing conflicts in newspapers, on television screens, and across social media platforms will inevitably be perceived differently in a museum exhibition or a published compilation decades later, right? So war photographs tend to accumulate the historical weight of the events they document with time. So there's much to explore, new ways of understanding and perceiving both historical and more contemporary conflicts. And I've barely scratched the surface of this fascinating subject, not least because it is a complex one with a remarkable history and multiple perspectives. Above all, my aim is to highlight the workings behind the images we see of war and the way they shape our perception of it. These workings are incredibly fascinating on their own, as I hope my 2 case studies have shown, and participants will learn how photography and the role of photographers has evolved in the context of conflicts, what has made certain photographs iconic. However I feel about that word iconic, have made the memorable and the impact of censorship, innovation, and changing norms on what captures the public's imagination, what the public rejects as a visual trope. So thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.